There's one thing we need to talk about. AIA certification hour signage is way in the back if you need to do it. Thank you very much. So I want to welcome Nader Tehrani to St. Louis. He's been here twice already. This will be his third time within the last 18 or 19 years. And I was going to just print out his CV and just read it to you, but I felt that was so impersonal. So I wanted to kind of tell you a story about him and to let you know how an educator could aspire and inspire a young architect to go on and do more than they're ever expected to do. So I met Nader in 1993. It was his first design studio that he's ever taught. And I was asked by Judy Wolin to take that studio because Nader, she believed that he was one of the best designers that she's ever met. And every time I went down the corridor, all my other faculties I had before asked me, you know, who are you taking this semester? And I said, Nader Tehrani. And all of them said, he's an amazing designer. You're going to have to stay up every night. And what happened is that he didn't just teach me how to design, but he taught me how to love architecture. In the sense that as an educator, you don't just criticize and teach, but you have to inspire someone. At the time when he was teaching us, he had 3 full-time jobs. He was working for Machado and Savetti, doing competitions. He was running Office Da at the time, and he was driving from Boston to Providence every couple of days, and even at nights to see his students. And there was a story when he told us that he fell asleep on Route 90 coming from Boston to Providence because he was so tired he couldn't drive anymore. And when we heard about that, you know, we weren't thinking about ourselves anymore. Doing our own projects became part of him and part of us. So we did it together. And that kind of community is such a powerful experience for a young person to understand that architecture transpires not about your self-education, it's about how you inspire and affect other people around you. And throughout time in St. Louis, when Heather and I had terrible problems doing building projects, we would always call him, and he gave us pretty amazing advice we thought that he would never say. He told us always, be there for the client, and don't be too arrogant.
I take it back.
Okay. So what we did was, this is advice he gave us, that if you could take 6 good photos of the building, that's good enough. But make sure the design drawings and models is in the highest quality.
I take it back.
But, you know, we actually really believe in him. And he's taken us a long way. And we've been quite successful in what we do. But his words became something very important to us in our hearts. And I hope that, you know, young students out there understand that architecture is more than just getting a degree and being a professional. It's about a dedication and sacrifices you have to make to be a good designer that has respect for yourself and how you could affect the community. Please welcome Nader Tehrani.
Thank you so much for this kind reception and for the introduction, a very personal one indeed. I've said much worse things, actually, and unfortunately some people remember that too. On the topic of how one does one's work, I noted in a different lecture a couple of days ago that there are projects that are really bad, but you can resuscitate them through photography, which is another appeal to realism, because the project lives in a kind of world of representation. And you can decide for yourself whether that is a legitimate practice of architecture. And then there are those projects that photograph, well, just fine, but never capture that thing which, let's say, experience or the haptic moment aspires to, and we're all victim to both sides of this equation. So if I were to update what I might have said a while ago, it would be that there's something about, and it's just as a preface, this talk will be almost like going back to the 19th century in comparison to what we've been hearing today. So I make no appeals to the contemporaneous of what we're working on, because almost steadfastly our commitments are to built environments. In part, that has to do with a historical moment. In other parts, it has to do with a decision. It's ideological in nature. There are so few people dedicated to the practice of architecture as a speculative act that we felt, in some way or another, the product of the 80s essentially, that if we did not figure out how to theorize practice itself, that somehow we will not have done justice to what we were meant to do. The tectonic image deals with that space of mediation between the act of building and the moment of inception, the generative moment in some moments, or the representational moment. These are different things, and we'll get to that. Last year, I was asked to go to the American Academy, and it was like a 2-month vacation, but it brought me back to that moment of acting on something that, where you need to externalize something, and yet all I wanted to do was eat and to be in the city and rediscover a city that I knew so well. At the top of the hill, not far from the Academy, sits the Tempietto. Michael Graves has drawn that. Almost everybody who's gone to the Academy has drawn that. And by the time I left, I had indeed gained 10 pounds, but I hadn't done one drawing. And so somehow it became my mission to, in a way, see how do you draw something that is so well known. And unfortunately, this, I don't have a pointer, but I think the pointer is a critical thing. But well, follow me if it doesn't read, you can ask me. But what I wanted to do is to redraw something that is known so well in an analytical medium that gives rise to a new meaning in such a way that no other drawing could do. And as such, the drawing becomes a forensic tool somehow. The problem with the Tempietto is that there's a very cryptic moment where this all comes together, and you can't see it from one point of view. You have to look down on it, and from below look up at it. And that critical moment is right here at the altar. The altar, from one perspective, is a solid monolith of marble, and reinforces the classical notion of a load-bearing wall in the way that we have seen all churches, all structures of the Renaissance. As you walk behind, you don't see the altar, you see a window that is essentially excavated out of the thin slabs of marble, and all of a sudden you come to the recognition, the realization that the altar is the window is the altar, and they're indistinguishable from each other. But what this does, it also gives rise to the collusion between, the necessary collusion between a form of representation that is both and. It is the traditional oblique looking down, but also the choisi looking up. In this drawing that you're looking at, there are 6 depictions of the dome and of the vault underneath, of the altar and of the window, of the ground, and of course ultimately of the crypt underneath, where St. Peter's would have been planted upside down. And so the narratives that are embedded in this are many, and of course the poché of the ground is the sky above. And so this inversion, you could almost turn the drawing upside down, and this inside out, outside in drawing describes itself. Behind all of this is another lesson that all of you know so well, but I learned much later for some reason in graduate school. We never actually encountered classicism in the way that you might imagine at RISD during the 80s. And so, coming from my background also, the kind of ornate linguistic surpluses of a classical order seemed alien to me. But this drawing says it in a nutshell, and what is extraordinary is that it explains somehow that there's a deep section to that ornamentation. The way in which the triglyphs embody the structure is such that we understand the reciprocity between structure and skin, if I were to say it in contemporary terms. But therein lies a hitch, because we know the structure is wood. We go inside and see it, if there were. And we also know that the triglyphs are in stone. So somehow, magically, in the discipline, some hundreds of years ago, there was a disciplinary device that allowed us to believe in the fiction that wood is allowed to petrify and become stone and represent that which is right just behind it. And therein lies a kind of ethic, the ethic of reciprocity, or the ethic of representation, if you like. Now, if that's not already heretical enough, have we not already done a huge leap? What happens next is that these triglyphs migrate to the front of the temple, as if, you know, it's just nice and sunny out. And of course, at that moment, you realize that this is crazy, because obviously the beams are not coffered and they're not going in two directions at the same time, and that there's something about our discipline that is exactly contrary to the morality that we're constantly burdened with about truth to materials, and a kind of valiant notion about do-gooding and truthfulness. And so this is that moment where when you come to a kind of recognition that structure may in fact be in service of the ornamentation. There's a kind of inversion of the logic of what we've been taught classically in school. So this is just to underscore the fact that we are always already in this space of indeterminacy. You may take a position and say, no, this is ridiculous, but nonetheless, the most truthful of buildings, and let's say the most fictitious, are in this soup of representational mediation, and there's no escape of that. At least I'll say that. The first half of this lecture will be foundational, and I apologize for those people who know the work, but it's a kind of 101 lecture that has to be rehearsed. I'm sorry. And then there's some new work in there also. But optics, as you well know, from the Renaissance, is a form of construction. It may not have to do with construction as a building practice, but nonetheless it is one. When we were called for our first commission to be part of the fabrications exhibit at MoMA, Terry Riley asked us to do a construction. But we don't want drawings, we don't want models. You may do them, of course, but that's not what we're going to exhibit. You have to do a fragment of a piece of architecture in the way that you might have had in a 19th century sort of architectural hall, fragments of architecture. We were interested to work in steel because it was outdoors and we'd never worked in steel before, but we wanted to not work with industrial sections, I-beams, channels, and so forth. The language that Terry spoke to us was about speaking to the contractors. In other words, find a way in which the discipline is engaged deep in practice. Tell us what it means to be plumb. Understand what tolerances mean. Show us what is level. Tell us what is right. And he even brought up the issue of rightness as almost an ethical thing. The idea that something is a right angle is also a demonstration of its correctness. What we wanted to do beyond architectural terms is to develop a canvas such that it was abstract enough that it had a way to be in the garden but speak back behind us to the Museum of Modern Art itself, and speak to the condition of modernity, the flat canvas, the idea that pictorial space would be flattened to the paint markings themselves. And so what we designed was some 50-odd panels that would be, well, as I said, perfectly plumb, level, and right. And such was the case of a construction that had to be thought through in through digital protocols. So plans and sections would make absolutely no sense here. We were working with an origami process that would require the flattening of a sheet of steel. By now, a conventional Rhino drawing can do this. But also working with Milgo Bufkin, who had done smaller, almost industrial design scale artifacts, offsetting that to a larger scale, whereby thicker steel would need to offset the laser cut scores. Again, remember, this is the 90s when, let's say, digital culture was more invested in notions of visualization and representation. We were more interested at that time at the interface between what it can do and what it means for the construction industry. We'll develop that in a bit. But the stitch seam was something that was developed with Milgo Bufkin. And indeed, the method of drawing had a direct correspondence with its method of construction. We did not want the traditional stringers, but the stringers became a template around which the folds could work, and indeed create an array of mass customized panels to become spatial, to become extraordinarily non-standard, perforated differently on every panel, and yet somehow the result of a modality that has absolutely nothing to do with construction. Indeed, its construction begins with perspective and the very challenge to it by its unwinding. You all know of forced perspectives and certainly its inversion in anamorphosis. And so here then anamorphosis is used as a mechanism to at the threshold over the bridge in the pool of the garden to test out the degree of tolerance this would need. And in fact, everything was folded within a half inch of tolerance, which is quite amazing given the medium that we were working in. Materiality has a relationship to all of this because as we draw things, we're not necessarily thinking of materials, unless we are, of course. When asked to do an addition onto an existing structure, our first impulse was to develop a new skin which had the possibilities of spatializing a threshold between the inside and the outside, but we didn't know exactly how that would be done. In going to the Home Depot, before Home Depot, this was Somerville Lumber, we said, well, corrugation is one of the most economic materials out there, and we began to play with it. Like everybody, we discovered the idea that corrugation is quite malleable on one axis, but also structurally rigid on the opposite. So vertically quite rigid and horizontally quite malleable. Now, what we also discovered, beyond what it could do architecturally in spatializing the skin, is that we said, well, obviously this is possible because the line at the top of the corrugation is exactly the same length as the line on the bottom. And behind this is a demonstration of the theorem of a ruled surface. And the ruled surface is essentially a kind of moment where you realize that architecture is distinct from illustration, from painting, and other pictorial arts in the sense that the act of drawing is already an act of construction. So this comes back to the question of optics and representation as a constructive tool. And in a way, the depiction of each of the ridges of the corrugation is exactly how a ruled surface is demonstrated. I can't hide, of course, that lurking behind this is a semantic bias, and that we work with figures. What can I say? And so one could imagine seeing apparitions of sorts in these structures, and yet they evolve and get interpretations that yield multiple readings over time. But it is important to sort of understand how these come to be. And there's certainly vast differences between visual and non-visual modes of composition. And this is what's odd about this next project, because it was done some 20, 25 years ago, but we're still drawing it today. And the reason we're drawing it is because I exited school the year that the computers were brought in. So almost every 2 or 3 years, I have to sit down in a tutorial by the next generation again and learn how to draw again, because the way we draw today is just different than the way we drew 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And of course, writing code is a completely different thing than drawing something. And therein lies the difference between, you know, my identity. That thumbprint of mine is my identity. If you looked at my thumb, that is what you would see. So there's a direct relationship and correspondence between the image of that thumb and, you know, the body that it represents, the identity that it represents. The barcode happens to be a representation of that same person, but it's done through indexical terms. And so there is also a fundamental shift or paradigmatic shift in the way that we are working right now, which is non-visual. And the difficulty for me, of course, is that, you know, we're interested in many ways of working. And in the instance of Casa La Roca, we were faced with, you know, that the figural impulse of giving body, giving shape to something in the way that you see on the left-hand side, but also relenting and finding ways that through the configuration of brick, that it would produce illusions without letting go of a secret, in a way through abstraction, operating somehow differently. Between these two images, there's another narrative, top-down thinking and bottom-up. Figuration is an act that comes with many a prioris. If I say basilica to you, you already have a mental image of a plan that may be a cross formation. It may be composed of a part-to-whole relationship of a nave, side aisles, transepts. You understand what the relationship of columns are to niches and apses and so forth. And then you know that that type has many, many versions of it as they're carried out in different sites and slightly different practices. But configurative thinking, which is what primarily I'll be speaking about tonight, is bottom-up. It imagines that an architect isn't necessarily designing things, but rather systems that may be deployed by others in very different ways. And so it's almost like writing the rules to a game rather than playing the game yourself. In this instance, of course, we're doing both. And I was always in wonder about the dimension of Leverance's brick walls, because his brick seemed to float in a sea of mortar, and you never understand why. And I thought, well, what if we began to think of the mortar as the key catalyst of a brick wall, such that it's the in-between space that is doing the work, not the brick itself? Going down to Caracas, we found stucco buildings, we found stone buildings, inside of which all of them were terracotta blocks, terracotta bricks, and tiles. And we said, okay, what if we develop a series of nodes numerically distinct from each other, such that the bricks are always static, but the joints between them can move, what we call the variable bond. In other words, it oscillates between what you would call a running bond and a Flemish bond. Thought through these terms in parametric terms, what we would call now, this has the ability not only to produce a field condition, but to expand and contract from solidity to voids, and be able to fold and give depth to something that is structurally and laterally braced, folded on the seam of the layout of the brick itself. And as such, no bricks are cut at the seam. In other words, this comes from the order of the brick. The only bricks that are cut are at this vertical seam where the lines are right. And as we test this out, of course, we gain the appreciation that this is in direct dialogue with an immense tradition of walls, from the Serpentine Wall at UVA to the walls of El Área de Este in Uruguay, and that somehow, if anything, our contribution to these walls is in understanding how they may be represented and generated differently. In other words, bringing a form of precision to not only their drawing, but how they're built. In fact, this was all built through with templates. But also in contributing the possibility of light and air into structures that historically were quite definitive, opaque, and divisive. In this case, the reason for the porous wall was that the clients had the in-laws living next door, and this was the only polite way of allowing them entry conceptually while barring them from direct visual view. The marriage didn't last. This is the sketch. I'm sorry, the parametric stuff was done about 5 years ago. The animation is something I worked on about 10, 15 years ago, and this is the sketch that was done on site some 20, 25 years ago. I also like to argue something that may go against the grain of certain arguments, but that is, one likes to imagine that there's an instrumental relationship between one's ability to think and draw. In other words, by using a certain tool, it produces the possibility of other things. This demonstrates another, that there are certain modes of thinking that are completely anachronistic. And so to think parametrically, we didn't need that tool, but it maybe was a kind of accidental moment where all of this was coming together at the same time. And I'm not trying to contradict the rule of instrumentality. I'm saying that both are important in a way to seize the moment. These are still, this is, 2 weeks, 3 weeks after it, as we put pencil to paper at that moment. And of course, building the model that was built beautifully, it's about this big, with large templates and jigs. With great humidity in Boston, it expanded and contracted such that nothing fit together, and we had to sand every little brick to be able to fit it back together, which is why they don't actually meet here if you look carefully enough. As I was doing my thesis at RISD, I was asked, well, what do you bring from your background to this project? And I had nothing to say. My teacher was Argentinian. I was educated in the United States, and I hadn't really looked at any books or grown up in Iran, so I had nothing to reflect on. With a cursory visit to the library, I discovered in a very superficial way some 300-400 years of extraordinary masonry work, which aligned quite strategically with what I was looking at. And I discovered that there's a distinct difference between the Seljuk period, the Safavid period, and the Qajar period. In the Seljuk period, the relationship between the image of the wall and what it represents is directly integrated into the mass of that brick. And by the time you get to the Safavid period, it is a load-bearing wall, and yet the bricks that are on the exterior are independent. They're not exactly like a curtain wall maybe today, but in a way not that distinct either. And by the time you get to the Qajar period, some 200-300 years later, they abandoned brick altogether, because with the crafting of tiles, ceramics, they realized that representation is completely indifferent to medium. They can do it through painting itself. And I remind you, in Islamic architecture, part of the motivations of iconography and decoration, if you will, and communication is non-figural. And that is an explicit part of the Islamic ethic. And so as you look at the orchestration of bricks and the way in which they're integral to the depth of the wall, you begin to appreciate the Seljuk mass, if you like, and its subsequent vicissitudes in the context of the Safavid, and eventually even the superficiality of the tile work in the Qajar period. As young architects, we were operating through installations, essentially, because that was the only way to build. We were not of this country, and we didn't have clients, but we were also looking at how to build, because we were never taught how to build in school, and so imagining what it means to build or build relationships between drawing and making was part of that task. And some of this came through borrowings. And as we looked at folding, obviously pleating was a kind of embedded part of that understanding. But as we looked at clothing and the traditional ways of navigating the bosoms and the buttocks, we also discovered the dart. And for those of you who sew and make clothing, it's a simple theorem that's an extension of the rule surface. That if you take a sheet of paper or cloth and cut a V into it, by bringing those 2 points back together, you create a conical surface. A conical surface is one of the typologies of the rule surface. And in doing so, can come into confrontation with different materials in different ways. Our testing was done in the context of wood, because we also came to appreciate that cutting with the grain and against the grain does radically different things. So material resistance is part of the game. So the computational moment was not sufficient. There was also a negotiation with material resistance. And so this moment of the groin, if you like, of this installation is the maximum moment before it yields materially, not so much structurally. The actual test of the installation was to build something that could perform three things: to wrap a column, to vault, and create an arch between the lecture hall and the library of the GSD, and then to produce a belly which served as the bottom continuous chord of a bowstring truss going in essentially 2-3 directions. the struts of which are concealed above it. When we got our first real commission, we were asked for this restaurant called Mantra to do a very nice small environment, no bigger than this area here, for a hookah den, to smoke hookahs. And with a budget of $230,000 for 6,000 square feet, the price that came back for the design of this little pavilion came out at $200,000, and we didn't know why. We didn't understand, and we were completely ignorant of this legal division between the architect and the contractor, putting us in charge of design intent and them in charge of means and methods. If there's ever been a castration of the discipline, this is the beginning of it, because it effectively renders the architect impotent of establishing any reciprocity between the representational act, the generative act, and the kind of the logistics of deployment. And so in many ways that, the idea of means and methods became the kind of hinge point for, our war in practice. And, well, this is what we wanted to build, but it was some $200,000 over budget. So we said, okay, how are we going to build this? We did a drawing of it, and we realized, okay, the system is basically the Casa La Roca of Caracas. It's wood pieces that are about 1 inch thick, 2 feet long, 3 inches wide, and they're virtually a circle folded at the base, and they come to a star-like figure at the top, which is like an oculus and quite structurally rigid because of it's a surface active structural system. We realized actually that if you did a full-scale drawing of it and pinned it up on the ceiling, as we did in the studio, you could build this yourself with minimal tolerances. Gravity is pretty reliable, by the way. And with the glue and screw method, get about 7 layers done per day. And if you can do that, you could build it in 30 days for about $30,000 with profit. And then you have about, another $170,000 to spend on the other stuff. So effectively, that became our entry into the construction industry in the design build aspect of what we're doing, and sort of see what is the relationship that we can build between modes of conception and modes of deployment. Performance has many meanings because obviously as you get into complex buildings like this, the amount of requirements, whether it has to do with heat loads and insulation and sprinklers and all of that, there's a technical performance to buildings that is quite unimaginable, but at the same time we think of the rhetorical importance as just as important. So I've never been one to hide from that thing which operates with, whether you call it representational, atmospheric, or even the affect of a building. We've always dived head first into this problem. And yet there's a strange ethic that we bring to it, and that has to do with this reciprocity between what constitutes interiority and exteriority. What is the relationship between the inside and the outside? And that is arbitrary, of course, because we also know that as we look at buildings, what is on the outside rarely has anything to do with what goes on the inside. Borrowing from this kind of egg that is inside the snake, one also appreciates the way in which, in the natural world, the tessellation of the skin of the snake is pregnant with this possibility of expansion and contraction. So these systems to which I speak are ready for performance anyway. So in the China project, which is the ultimate manifestation of the Casa La Roca building, problems of drainage, the smoke, the light, and the circulatory systems are already embedded in a building made out of brick using the variable bond that expands and contracts in accordance with the performances and the functions it has to hold. And so here you can see the drainage system being activated by the bonding system that leans over to kind of slope all of the hydrology away from the building. And you can see also the fact that, in fact, in a seismic zone of considerable force, this is not a brick building. Like a good Roman wall, the brick is actually a formwork for the concrete, and the strength of the wall obviously comes from the ductility of the steel. And so the brick is a kind of active skin that is not only formwork for the belly of the cantilever, but it is excavated underneath the building where the mechanical systems are, where it breathes, and it's an active protagonist in giving legibility to the ways in which the building is orchestrated. What's great about this building for me, this is purely anecdotal, is that somehow it was covered in 2 history books in China very early in its construction, and it became a heritage building. And when Beijing grew, 5-10 years later, they couldn't demolish it when the roads had to expand. So they had to roll the building down railroad tracks some 60 feet back. And so we saw these images roll out, actually, as we were looking at our internet screens. I should mention that without the political work of Ai Weiwei, this would never have been possible. So there's an interesting story behind that, too. I could say many things that we did with digital protocols, but at the end, it was only his politics that built this. I've already spoken to, a kind of a latent semantic bias in all of these things, and really that is the world in which we were educated. It's completely different that of today. Sometimes it's nice being old just because you get to see the arc of certain theories coming back in full force, and Complexity and Contradiction remains one of my favorite texts for that reason. But I always enjoyed looking at the drawings of Ledoux and Lecoeur because they were quite frontal with the issue of representation and architecture parlante, the architecture that speaks. And I always loved this little passage in The Little Prince where the arbitrary relationship between the signifier and the signified is illustrated through, the hat and ingested elephant, which is a central part of what we're constantly dealing with in the oscillating potential of meaning in any piece of architecture. Nonetheless, as you look at the Lecoeur drawing, I do also enjoy the way in which somehow encrypted in the body is the idea that the shoulder blades inform the arch, or how the snout informs the fountain, and that there are these kind of opportunistic relationships between how the performance of the building and the forms it takes on. And as we come to confront these in this day and age, we also appreciate the ways in which historic structures have done pretty incredible feats. The ground was always very stubborn and remains quite stubborn. Outside of Jussieu, we still don't know of buildings that are able to afford non-flat surfaces. Maybe the Yokohama port terminal finds strategically certain moments of promenades that are able to do this, but the stubbornness of the ground in relationship to the architecturality of the dome is undeniable and remains today a kind of architectural ground zero until we're able to rid ourselves of this damn thing called gravity. For that reason, we constantly look at the performance of domes, the double shells, and the different representations they have urbanistically from the outside, but also representationally distinct from the inside as you look up. And yet you and I, all we have to do when we design is to do the reflected ceiling plan. And actually, they've done a pretty organized job here, but I'm saying that those of you who do practice can appreciate that for all of our education, we're never actually confronted with the reflected ceiling plan. It seems like an absurd thing to do in school, and yet we've constantly been the victims of this fifth elevation, and we're screwed by it daily. And so that has become a 10-year project for us, and the first of which, ironically, is the project that is the most published and most copied in the world. It's very funny because it came out right before the crisis in 2008, and it was dismantled within a year or two. But it was a restaurant designed underneath a new developer building. And what happens in these developer buildings is that all of the mechanical systems of the units above get placed in the space below, and without the kind of ability to determine and control it. So we decided, say, okay, we're going to work with this. We're going to evacuate the ground from clutter so that you can make 2-seaters, 4-seaters, 6-seaters, whatever it may be, but we will delay the ceiling for as long as we can because it's actively under construction, and lay out a rule for it, and only a rule, and that is that we're going to build a series of slats that are about 9 inches apart, 9 inches deep, and the only rule is that they come together around the columns, otherwise it wouldn't look right because you'd see too much of the column. And it would become a kind of proscenium on one angle, as it gives the illusion of smoothness, but completely porous on the other, where you see the backstage of what's happening. In this case, you see the bottles of the wine room and so forth, but essentially the lighting, the mechanical system, the sprinklers are all in full view in those views, and the bulges are in a way an approximation of that shrink wrap as we brought it together in the final instance. The contractors on this job were the contractors in Boston that do all of the Dunkin' Donuts. And so their ability to fabricate this was almost nil. So this was the first project that we ourselves project managed for the first time, taking it through construction. As this gets translated into public jobs, and this is the beginnings of the Adams Library in Dorchester, south of Boston, a process that is extremely grueling from the perspective of authorship, because the question of process, collaboration, control, and I think this came up in some of the last sessions, but what is it that we do as architects? We specify. We have an instrument that is our legal, in a way, mandate, and it's the contract documents. The contract documents are composed of drawings and specifications, and these are our only controlling mechanisms. Now, what do we do with these? Either they're a legal instrument, so we represent the client as best as possible, but you and I know that we only sort of represent the clients. What we really care about is the discipline. So it also becomes the only way in which you can exact the thing that is most vulnerable in the way that we all practice. So I can't defend the plan of the Adams Library. I can only tell you that somehow in the community process, the grown-ups were divided from the adolescents and the kids. And there was a central point of control that produced a kind of panoptic condition that everybody could be seen from by 1 or 2 people max, because that's all you can afford for surveillance. And the hinge point, ironically, around all of this is not that the kids are going to be doing something bad, but that local libraries, for the most part, are used by grown-ups for pornography. And that is, the sequestering of the grown-ups is more important than the oversight of the kids. So the kind of three-leggedness of this thing gains its form basically from that. But this is not the story. The story is about the fifth facade. It's what's up there and, of course, what happens on top. The budgets for these projects are incredibly low, and so we realize that all of a sudden that we're in a community and in a context where there's a main street that is substantially public. It's the main driveway and the main route, as it were, that connects Dorchester to Boston, whereas the back street is all small triple-deckers and so forth. And in my drives around New England, I discovered this thing called the brick-sided house. And essentially what it is that there's a series of public and sometimes less than public buildings that have the classical portico in front, replete in either marble or stone. Sometimes it's done in wood, of course. And then for reasons of fire or economy, they're made up of brick on the side, and then wood in the back sometimes. So this odd way in which these buildings are brought together almost seamlessly at a corner, at the oblique corner, indifferent to that which you and I may call the integrity of a building. It's like the wallpapering of these things to a crisp line. It seems almost as unarchitectural as if you think of the ethics of construction. But I guess what I like about these is that they're overtly representational. They are unapologetic about the rhetorical nature of the front, the side, and the back. And of course, for us, it became an alibi to radicalize the difference between that which is the front, and it had to be a single-story building. No budgets for elevators, no tolerance for half heights. It is an extension of the sidewalk. And so the ceiling and the roof, as one entity, became a vehicle by which to acknowledge these two scales. A single pitch in the front and multiple pitches in the back that speak to the very back alley, which motivates the site. So simply said, the scale of Main Street the community passage towards the back, getting you to the high school, the mediation between the two and the hydrology that has resulted in it with the cistern in the back and the control of the water, bringing light into the south and bringing that pavilion to the north around an existing elm tree that is a large aspect of the site. The three cohorts are divided, the adults, the adolescents, and the kids in three different zones, and the roof beams are actually running exposed LVLs in the opposite direction. So there's a kind of tectonic grain that is overlapping each other in perpendicularity as you go through the building, and the task, let's say the architectural task, is to not do a ceiling, allow the beams and the space of the beams to house the mechanical systems, the lighting and so forth, and effectively connect to the one outdoor space, which is the exterior reading room that is held to the other side of the building. And then working with terracotta, essentially demarcating the formality of the front in a kind of white glazed terracotta, and the back and the sides in dark glaze and a natural matte glaze on the other. But in a way, for all that one can control, and that is very, very little, the control of the reflected ceiling plan, in both its representational and its performative aspects, gained traction because, in a way, the building had to drain, and nobody could refute that. There is also the ghost of contextualism, the ghost of history, the omnipresence of a kind of liberal social state with deep conservative proclivities when it comes to architecture. And for us, how to play with that in such a way that it establishes a kind of strategy of the Trojan horse, working in two ways at the same time. As we go to larger buildings, the prospect that representation can address the battleground of construction becomes even more urgent. In the Daniels Building in Toronto, we were to build the extension of the architecture school in the center of Spadina Circle, with all of the kind of small rooms in the existing building and the large studio to the north with a new facade for the first time, embedding all of the additions into the landscape with adjoining urban spaces that activate the circle and make sure that the tower is not blocked by the addition with only one window, a northern window that brings light, ambient light to the studio spaces. As a building, it is the most compact and dumb building you can imagine. It's just a square that's plugged in like a keystone into the building. But as a project, it is a robust piece of landscape urbanism in the way that it negotiates the territory. The studio space that sits underneath that roof is the reason for this story. The building, which is quite economical by any measure, is a concrete building that rides up 3 stories and sectionally gets aligned at different moments with the streets. As the streets come down into the Fab Lab in the basement, as streets go through it, connecting University of Toronto to the Kensington neighborhood, to the south where there's the sun, and then the studio space is this space aloft. There's only 2 columns on the top floor, and they are the cores. And essentially, almost operating like the Firth and Forth Bridge, by cantilevering with a backspan on 2 sides, you're able to get a columnless hall up there for the flexibilities that a studio space may require. And of course, we'd imagine the kind of folded roofs that Candela may have done as an extension of this concrete logic. And the elevation, in a way, is a register of the way in which essentially the structure, the daylighting, and the hydrology would all come together down these sideburns, these seams that bring the water back into the landscape and irrigate the site. So the project's investment really was this moment. You're building up to this moment. And these skylights, by the way, are not merely lighting this room. They're all coming all the way down into the central hall, which is a dark space at the core of the building. So it is the idea of the building. And as I said, there's a kind of rule to the system. We understand how surface active structural systems work. And on one of my trips to Melbourne, we were working on another project there. At the time, I got a call saying that the roof is out. It's going to be flat, and we're going to get round skylight that will populate it. And I said, why? Because you don't know how to build. You are good architects, and therefore you draw well, but you don't know how this is going to come together, and it's $1 million over budget. So what we did was we did the same thing as the mantra Hukaden. I said, okay, let's first of all draw this up. Again, there's nothing really complicated about this. It is a ruled surface in each flank of it. Let's build it in the basement. Our basement is large enough to build one of these flanks. We did a little bit of research and we realized that there are actually gypsum board products out there, this has nothing to do with our invention, that are radiant panels. And as such, you can get the heating from the concrete in the ground, but the cooling in the radiant panel overhead. And so the human body is between a kind of ice cream sandwich where heating and cooling is done in different seasons in between. And then in order to make it affordable, we went with a kind of low resolution solution. Abandon the concrete, despite the ethic of the building, go with a truss that will then essentially get the ceiling, a smarter ceiling, which is basically rooted in the functions of its mechanical system, and see what it does to the pricing. And so this led to about an $800,000 reduction in that price. And this very thing started construction about 2 months later. And so the dumbness of the solution also came down to the ability to establish this reciprocity between the representational act and the mock-up and its deployment on site, the plastering, the painting, as it were, and its eventual completion. For those of you who have visited it, you may agree with me. And for those of you who haven't, I think it's an important lesson for us. If the majority of our projects require an ethic of craft, this building, which for me or for my money is a great building, is terribly built. It's badly crafted, and I would not make a case for it. But the partie is so strong, it still holds the building. It's a kind of robust idea. And so there are many aspects of it that I'm not going to be speaking about that have to do with its planning that are quite solid. And it's resilient in the sense that people can make changes to it, but it is a very strong thing. And then there's that argument about photography. It's that, in a way, you can take pictures of it as much as you want, but it'll never tell you what I'm describing as its positive aspects. But effectively, it has to do with many aspects of the promenade that come through the main street, look up a Spadina, look up into the studio spaces underneath the belly of this thing, connect back out through the Fab Lab, and back into the Great Hall on the interior, go back into the landscape, and acknowledge that the figure of the roof and the transparency that is produced by that fifth elevation is a central part of the way that this facade overhead works, and that all of this is situated around the Great Hall, which is the dark courtyard space that is at the core of the building that gains a large window, such that when there are these large lectures, all of the overflow is in these spaces. And so there's despite the fact that it's deeply monolithic as a building, it's also very urban in its infrastructural tentacles and the way that it connects to the city. The tectonic grain, I make references to the biological and to the natural world, but somehow when we look at the zebra, we sort of naturalize the way in which each of the species hides itself and camouflages itself in the context of nature. And so when we look at its stripes, I mean, they're rather beautiful, I have to say, and they're seductive. It's only when I change the slide that you realize that the first is absolutely artificial, because we all know that the striping of the zebra, in fact, is perpendicular to the torso in the same way that it's perpendicular to its limbs. Architecturally, you may argue that the architecture happens at the corners, where it's turning those corners. And that's the difficult thing we constantly go through. It is then that you realize that almost everything that you and I do is about artifice. There is nothing natural in anything that we do. And so we should be reminded of that in the way that Kahn would remind us about what a brick wants to be. The brick never wanted to be anything. We wanted it to do this and that. And so what I'm trying to say is that the responsibilities of the representational moment are actually paramount to that little thing that we can do in culture. We have done many projects by now. Some of them are, rather economical, and other ones are not. This is one of those first projects that we got without any experience, but is one of my favorite projects for certain reasons. It is not for the reason that it's a 2,000 square foot house with 4 cars. But being what it is, we wanted to build a rural building in New England that is composed of the most unpretentious shed construction system, and that is the board and batten. Unlike the shiplap or the tongue and groove, it's the dumbest ways in which boards are just covered with a batten and brought to rest. I've already spoken about shrink wrapping and the ways in which a building like this may reveal itself, but essentially the logic of the building also mandates that in order for the garages to be hidden, the board and batten system needs to go over it and come all the way down. And we have another ethic that says that we don't buy products and stick them onto them. So even the door handles are, in a way, an unwinding of that very system as it comes down and over. But that also informs another ethic, which has to do with the tectonic grain, that somehow latent within any building or any building system, there are moments of opportunity, and they also define that thing, which we may call an ethic, which is altogether irrelevant to a broader public, but that remains a kind of disciplinary function that I would still fight for. And as we look at nature, as we look at a log and the way that we put a saw to it, we are completely conscious that a plain sawn log is different than a quarter sawn, for precisely the reasons that the quarter sawn gives you a beautiful grain that a plane can never control. And that's why it's more expensive. And as you go shopping for veneers, you recognize that this is an exercise in and of itself. I'm jumping back and forth in history now because this is that moment in time in our careers when we didn't have clients, so we commissioned ourselves to do a series of pieces of furniture, working with butcher block technology, using plywood, to use the artificial grain of the end grain of the plywood to build in a logic that would speak to the quarter sawn of both the walnut as well as the zebra wood within it. Now, if you look at the oblique corner of this, it goes back to a very classical problem that both Bramante and Palladio had to deal with, and that is how one turns a corner. And you can see the way in which the end grain and the walnut are almost book matched around one corner. It's a perfect oblique, excuse me. You also see the way in which the top of the table folds down and therefore confirms the continuity of another corner on the other axis. But of course, you also recognize that the third corner is an unsurmountable architectural problem. You always get the perpendicularity of those two grains. That is what for better or for worse, drives us. That which is completely irrelevant to everybody else, but remains a kind of conundrum and a predicament that is, let's say, between the formal and the social. If you're not so moved by this, then check this out, because as you begin to model the table legs, that natural grain that evolves out of the shaven part of that wood is absolutely artificial, of course, because it is a shaving against the grain of the end grain. And if you're not moved by this, then check out Santa Maria della Pace. I love this because I'm not a historian, and I still have yet to meet the historian that's going to explain exactly what happened. Was Bramante perverted, or was he negligent? Did he forget to lay out the classical system in such a way that it would not swallow the corner of the capitals? For me, the fact that he built that is almost much more important than if he had erased it. Because that's the consciousness that architecture is doing something. So this idea of the tectonic grain comes to play in the DC house. I'll try to be really fast about this. Trying to erase the iconography of a Neo-Georgian house by taking the brick from the south facade, opening up windows so that they could get a better relationship to Rock Creek, and using that brick for the upper portion of the building, the attic as it were, and connecting the basement to the garden, which is at a lower level. In doing so, the family remains intact with the friends and family all in the neighborhood. The character of the neighborhood is preserved, and the brick structure actually has to go through some radical changes, because by the time that you open up all of these windows, you're taking a load-bearing wall system and transforming it into a curtain wall system. And by doing that, beyond the openness that it produces in relationship to the landscape, you're creating a hybrid between a cellularly conceived plan and a free plan in the way that you might have imagined a Le Corbusier or Messiaen plan. Although the way that we structured it was to fashion the extensions of the building over time as party walls, and because there wasn't a good contractor on it, to expand the millwork such that the grain of the millwork reinforces the transparency of the building from north to south, but structures your experience between the public and private spaces. And as such, in one moment, in one act, at the moment of entry, the entire anatomy of the organization of the building is revealed. You come in, the dual living rooms, the summer living room and the winter one, are revealed in the first double height space. As you go up the stairs, the homework for the kids is there, and it connects to the kids' playroom at the top. And then all of the bedrooms remain intact as they were, and they're rather actually, for, let's say, for a wealthy house, a rather unpretentious set of dimensions. The grain is what is at stake here. The north-south grain of the building guarantees the transparency of views and light all the way to the northern facade, but also the insularity and the closure to the kitchen and the family room and all of the bedrooms on the other axis. Without doors, these are walls that slide with a kind of Piranesian return as they go around. And of course, the problem of the corner is very much there. This grain, once taken to its ultimate possible destination, is what informed our submission for the building at the American campus in Beirut. Because of the shortlist and because of the guarantee that we would not win, what was great about that project is that we could do the project that we wanted to do. Zaha Hadid was an alumna of the school, and the rest of the people on the short list were like us, basically nobodies. And we said, this is a great moment to do what we like to do. Around that time, Ito's building had just come out, and I had not gone to see it, but I loved this image of it, where the kind of collapse of the artificial and the natural are superimposed each other, the tree in the foreground and, you know, the tree in the background. Years later, I was surprised to see a rather unremarkable interior, which is a nice boutique, of course, but in a way, if you think of it as an architectural problem, it is neither the manifestation of the branchness of the trees on the inside, nor a Lothian interior for that matter. It is just what it is. And therefore, it collapses back into a discourse that you and I are very familiar with. You know, this dichotomy between the duck and the decorated shed, the decoy here. So before we started, we knew the answer, and we were ruthless about it. This isn't our project. This is us being teachers, presumptuous that is, but teachers nonetheless, correcting Ito's work. And we knew before we started that our building is part of the natural landscape of Beirut, not its architectural campus. So if these are the buildings of the AUB, this is a huge bosque of trees, and that is the first building that is embedded in that bosque. There was an existing building there. So before we started the design, we knew it would look something like this. That behind the row of palms, the cedars, and the ficus lies a building that is the result of a system that spatializes this logic. So we had to find that logic. And we start with that logic with a very simple observation, that a triangle and a hexagon have an organic relationship with each other. Essentially, the hexagon is a truncated triangle. And with that, you can make a column, I suppose you can make a pilotis, you can transfer loads from one axis to another at midspan somewhere, and you can make a wall out of it. In other words, it's replete with the possibilities of a lexicon that can bring an ordered disorder into some kind of confluence as you aggregate plans on top of each other which are not non-abiding in relationship to each other. We also know that gravity is such that it will make weight at the bottom such that the poché can make space, and we know that if any transfers happen, they happen above that, and obviously that the loads are always lighter at the top of the building than at the bottom. So how we begin to manifest that produces the possibilities of a building that in other terms could be seen as a domino frame. And now this is another logic where the distortions come out of an intervention into a dumb frame. Here, the transfer beam over public spaces, or the way in which the backspan of a cantilever may be fashioned into an auditorium with a sloped floor, or alternatively how the building just gets lighter columns as it goes to the top. Here, the reciprocity between the spatial order of the building and the mass of the building become complete. And therefore, the building then has four orientations, and one of them is a large outdoor space that looks back onto the city, and on the opposite side, looking over the Mediterranean, where the logic of the skin and the frame come into this dialogue with each other. That similar logic is the result of a renovation of a rather bad project, but nonetheless important because of the way it was conceived digitally. That is, our first BIM process that had to build a skin on top of an existing structure, coming up with a system that could become a column, a capital, a sign, and in fact a pay station, a kind of signifier for BP as it went through the transition from British Petroleum to Beyond Petroleum. Again, it's not a project that I like to boast. It's almost a system, and it is also part of those things that you get into and you can't control. as we move into the last chapter, it's no secret that what drives us in great part is not what we do per se, but it's the cultural project to which we are participant. And so when we look at CISA's Expo, I can't but also imagine how that as a structural system speaks to what maybe Kahn was thinking in the way that he interpreted the collusion between a bowstring truss and the idea of a theater that become one, or in some ways the ways in which that structure may become optimized by Gaudi with the hanging of weights and chains turned upside down, and the way in which Axel Killian would then take that and make it an instrument for simulation in the way that we work today. For me, these are at once operating on many levels of performance, as I said before, because these are operating at the height of performance in the strict structural sense. This is, by the way, the crypt underneath the Escorial. It appears as a vault. It is not. It is an absolutely flat ceiling. And so instead of having a keystone in the center, all of the stones are angled such that they're keystones, and all of the pressure is in those corners. And our challenge for the BSA was to build a compressive catenary by inverting the concept of the keystone into an interlocking system that is then held in suspense such that you can stand on top of it as you climb into it at the top of the stairs. But the idea of suspended systems is something that migrates from one project into the other, and I'm just showing this as a way of demonstrating the idea that projects obviously start in one place and then extend into others as they go into large institutional projects like the Melbourne School of Design. The Melbourne School of Design is an interesting one because it wanted to compete with RMIT as a design school, but it never had studios. It wanted a new building that had design studios. Within a month of the programming, we realized that they didn't have the money for dedicated studio desk space. And so immediately it became a hot desking building. The only thing they would give us were 3 visiting critics that could be housed in a totemic location that could become the studio spaces, and then everything else would be hot desks around it. So the partie of the building in many ways was determined almost within a month and rather unexceptional. But in imagining a space like that, we also did a little bit of work in history, conjuring up an inexact relationship between the Tempietto, again, Kahn's British Museum and Gary's building in Berlin. In the Tempietto, you have a figure within the context of a monastery that is indifferent to that figure, a folly, an idealized object that in its own way has a relationship to the geography over which it overlooks. But the Tempietto is indifferent to its context, and that's what makes it exceptional. It is incarcerated in a court that is that you can only see through the gate. In Kahn, the figure that is held within the courtyard is an extension of the configuration of the concrete post and lintel system that becomes exposed actually in the painting gallery and takes essentially a fire stair, rather unexceptional as a program, and monumentalizes it into this totemic object that through its silence, through ellipsis, becomes something quite important. Gary takes that and brings it back into the dichotomous world. I mean, in a strange way, Kahn is more dealing with the both-and condition of figures and configurations. Gary wants none of that. He invents a context, which for him is very dry, in order to amplify the zoomorphic spectacle of that boardroom or meeting room in the center. And it's a spectacular building in great part because both sides of his talent come into full exposure here. But all of these projects share one thing in common. The figure-ground relationship between the figure and the field are maintained intact. For Melbourne, what we wanted is to develop a configurative system, a structural system of LVLs that span over 22 meters with coffered interlocking systems that bar the access of direct sunlight into the space by slanting to one side, essentially, and draping from that a wood structure that would never touch the ground, a suspended structure that goes from large compressive elements to members held in tension from the top. Now, by doing that, you're undertaking these two forms of performance. On the one hand, there's the structural performance of actually taking large pieces of timber and making them work in tandem with each other to interlock and suspend the structure. And on the other hand, it's a representational system because you're actually taking the veneers of those very coffers and bringing them down the sides, shifting it to one edge so you have access to it, a kind of contrapposta position, and mapping almost in an inverted tectonic, the exact opposite of a classical palazzo, where the rustication is at the bottom. Here the rustication is at the top, with a kind of entasis that heaves down as the large members of this, the coffering, the massive elements of above are inhabitable in the structural space at the very top of the roof, and then get suspended down in one studio space, and its descent all the way to the lower spaces. As you go down, you begin to see the thinness of those veneers, not only in their perforation for acoustic reasons, but also the baffle systems that give an open space of a conference area, an almost acoustic enclosure with all of its sprinkler systems interdispersed in between. This metamorphic condition operates, if you like, at a kind of architectural level, an autonomous level. But in a strange way, the hot desks that you see all around here have become so successful that the designers in the building, it's the Melbourne School of Design, are upset because the entire campus is using it, and they don't have their hot desks anymore. The issue of the tectonic grain plays with this idea of structure and the kind of simulation of structure in both ways. At one level, we like the idea that the relationship between structure and skin becomes ambiguous. At another idea, we like the idea of redundancy in overcoming the hierarchies between structural members and skin. And so for the bridge in Melbourne, which is a kind of second collaboration with John Wardle, we had to do another ceiling project. In this case, because the pedestrian bridge that connects to the tennis open is only used two weeks a year. So the building, the structure, is all about its presence in the park, because that's the location in which it's seen. So we were wondering what it would mean to use rebar, and by cross-laminating it on the longitudinal and the perpendicular axis, this would become the means by which it would not only wrap it, but create the maximum moment at the deepest moment of its reflected ceiling plan, while navigating this delicate terrain between having to perform structurally underneath, but also become railings and, of course, lamps for the top that are in dialogue with the skyline beyond. So this idea of developing a representational system that is in sync with its structural system is, in my mind, what I call a kind of catalytic idea. For those of you who know me, you also know that I actually failed all my structural exams, so the last person to be speaking about this, but it's also the thing that I've spent most of my life focused on. I've always been, in a way, mystified by, our natural acceptance of typological orders. We all know what vector active systems are, form active systems, and surface active, and yet we rarely come to confront them as conventions that can be overcome. And yet, that was my task at Georgia Tech, to develop a system, much like our observations of the world, to imagine that water can become snow or ice. How do you develop a structural system that can migrate from one condition to the other? Essentially developing a tectonic unit that through the transformation of the XYZ axis can actually, on the basis of a unit, go from a brick-like module to a surface-active module to a truss-like vector-active module, going from a 2-prong to 4-prong system and to 8. And so for this installation, for the Venture-led chair, in a way, each of these bubbles represent a structural chapter in confluence and continuity with each other. A stacked brick base, a laterally braced wall, much like the wall in Caracas, a truss that spans 30, 40 feet, and a cantilever that does another 15 feet beyond that. The only rule was that we're working with this polycarbonate and that we're respecting the numerical logic of 2, 3, 6, 12, 24, 36, etc., such that when it all comes together, not only each typological chapter is legible, but that the entirety explains itself in numerical terms. And so what you're really looking at right now is this entirety minus the cantilever in the back, and this inexplicable mass of bubbles is essentially a series of truss-like units that go from the vertical to the horizontal axis, with each unit rotating around a gear 1 notch at a time. Here in Korea, I think is not important. I'll go forward and merely bring a kind of closure to one of the key arguments that I'm trying to make here about figures and configurations, and how even if you start from two ends of the spectrum, often they end up in the same place. In this case, the bowl and the nest are virtually the same things, but that somehow the figure of the bowl conceals the aggregate from which it is constructed, whereas the blades of grass that become the precondition of the nest may yet constantly become something else. And in fact, nests are many figures and many organizations besides this one. And so when we were confronted with concrete for the first time, we realized that all of the theories that we had laid down in prior times were irrelevant. In many ways, we didn't know how to do the project because the unit of construction was no longer quite there anymore. I mean, I suppose the sheet of formwork could become the index that corresponds to the concrete, or the post-fabrication work could do that too, but it's a liquid state that needs to figure itself out quickly. A project in southern France that is in fact in a dense suburban but natural site was also farmland. And so one of the ideas was to make a contemporary building that is stealth, such that it does not necessarily have to directly confront the cliches of the Mediterranean red tile roofed house. The logic of the building is simple. It's a courtyard building on an anomalous site that arranges itself to the optimal views to the Mediterranean and to the western side where there's a bosque of trees. The courtyard, on the other hand, is on the side of a hill, and so it distorts to a lower and upper wing, having to use two corners as the hinge of circulation to make the donut complete. The living areas above and the bedroom areas below, and a landscape that goes through it on the opposite diagonal, revealing the very stair that is the support for the front facade, which is not a facade, it is a beam. The building just complete, the beam as it cantilevers over the entry, the promenade as it comes up and through the entryway and into a courtyard that is somehow contained, and you can walk around bare in there without being seen by anybody, to the pool area, and really a kind of amazing view over the Mediterranean. Typologically, at the end of the day, it's like a case study house. It's a dumb glass box that overlooks the view on one side. What we contribute to it is something that Kahn did at the Kimball. We span the long way, not the short way, and by doing that, we allow the western light and the bosque of trees to enter into the house, as well as a good passage of air and light to go through there. And indeed, bringing the landscape through from the inside out and the outside in, it's part of the magic of the site. You can now see that we lost the battle of the red tile. There's a lot of other battles that we lost here. I'm not going to tell you them right now. Our project was dedicated to two modalities of representation that deal with concrete construction. One is this amazing historical project of fabric-formed work or digitally formed work, where we would essentially take the abstraction of modernism and bring it into the dialogue with the rustic nature of the stone walls of southern France. And here you can see different animate testings of that rusticated wall that comes from the crisp envelope and migrates to the inside. It's kind of cool, but at the end of the day, not so convincing. And so I said, well, what if we think of it a different way? If we go back to the idea of that bowl and think that even a bowl has aggregates inside of it, let's start from the constructive logic of the interior and recognize that they're going to want smooth surfaces for the artworks and the bodies that are leaning up against it, and go to the rustication of the earth and the stone walls of the landscape. Think of the way in which Wright actually adopted the kind of Fred Flintstone-y, robust relationship between, stone and mortar or stone and concrete. So what we did is that we imagined the concrete in panels that are cast with different sizes of aggregate, such that the figure-ground relationship between concrete and aggregate inverts to the point that it becomes just mortar between the natural stone walls that are part of the landscape that go into the preservation area out towards the back. Of course, neither were done ultimately, and the natural grain of wood was the dominant expression of the building, and the kind of earthen redness of the local soil is one of the more extraordinary aspects of this without dye. I end this with a realization and a recognition of something I didn't know the first time I went to Rome, and this is something that you and I are all going through right now. The relationship between construction and representation is such that the streets of Rome are in a strange way an index of our bodies. As we bend down on our knees and we lay out the stone, the cobblestone, the arc is the arc of our reach. In a strange way, if you take that all the way for 2,000 years plus to the moment of tagging of subways, that is still in a way what we describe when we do construction projects. They refer to one-person stones or two-person stones before you get to the problem of the crane or the other kinds of machines that we have to do. What interests me now, that I obviously have not addressed, but that many others in the room will, is this machinic moment in which robotics cancels out the great majority of what I've presented, because it effectively overcomes the industry-based laminar nature of the wall section potentially, and certainly also the construction seams that we know of or think of at the moment. And this is what I'm looking forward to. Thank you very much. I don't know what the convention is. I'm more than happy to take questions or party.
You guys want to ask a question?
Yes.
So you touched on like the association between a material and its method, and the skill and I guess the respect that you have to have between the two. And a new method that has come out is that of 3D printing, especially with still a very old material. I wonder what ways that you see it influencing the role of architecture in the future.
Well, I mean, there are numerous people that are doing great experiments with 3D printing. I think Sanfratello and what are their names? The guys in Berkeley. What I like about their practice is not that they 3D print, is that they put things that don't belong in the 3D printer in the 3D printer. And so I think what interests me is not so much the machinery, but the hacking of what you're actually printing out. I think that is rather interesting. I think to some degree the kind of work that is being done by Skylar Tibbets with heat and moisture is interesting, because he's looking at abstract systems like geometry, but also seeing how they're animate in the same, those things which I animate, he does as a science, and in a way he shows those contractions in action, in a different form of performance. Others like Brandon Clifford are doing something even more anachronistic. They're going back to the ancient, trying to figure out how they would move massive pieces of stone that are 20 feet long and tall. So for me, what is interesting about 3D printing maybe are not so much the innate rationalizations and optimizations they produce, which they will, of course, but other forms of logics that may emerge from them also. And certainly we are not on the leading edge of that. And this is, I have to say, apologetically, I'm not sure if it's apologetic, it's simply lamentably what happens when A, you practice a lot and you want to practice, and B, the worst thing that can happen to you by becoming a dean, because you are ostracized from the very thing that you should be doing. So I don't consider what we're doing now always on that edge. And yet we're trying to do that constantly with our most recent work with cross-laminated timber and so forth. But I feel that on the one hand that industry is always behind us, they're lagging behind, and so if we don't do that which we imagine, both at a representational and a research level in school, it may never find its way into the industry. So anecdotally, I will say that the best thing that we've done is change the industry in the context of what we've done in Boston, and I'll give you this anecdote. Sean Keller is a young guy who inherited a nice millwork shop in New Hampshire from his pop. And what did they do? They did nice cabinetry for all of the corporate offices in Boston. He was the one with whom we collaborated at first to do the millwork for the Bank restaurant. He didn't understand Rhino or the ways in which he would have to change his shop to do that. but he gave a lot of his services for free and eventually started hiring those people that we would hire to become the people that he would oversee his shop. And he did a lot of interesting things. For us, he did the DC house. For Mark Goulthorpe, he did that project in Cambridge. And eventually he did a couple of these canonical houses for Stephen Hall and this and that. But what was more interesting is that the skills that he understood and became an expert at became the vehicle for which they did all of the formwork for the concrete of the aquarium in Miami and the Apple project in California. So this shift in modality is a very important one. The other one, of course, is, who are the folks in Kansas? Somebody remind me? Zahner, yes. I mean, Zahner's another one of those people that, let's say, started as a kind of curtain wall-y skin kind of company, but has ventured outside of that spot to become much more integrative in the way that it's thinking of structural, mechanical, and waterproofing systems in a more complex light. So these are just two, let's say, of the leading figures. But what's more interesting is that there's dozens of people that are in the next generation that are starting shops and doing very interesting things. C2 Studio from Cooper Union is one of those, and there are many others. But I think that the shift that is happening strangely is not what we're doing, but it's in the other forms of practices that have both professionalized and given other avenues to the kind of research that comes from this. But I think it's an important one, and probably we're seeing only the fetal moments of it right now. I think it's going to be very different in about 10, 15 years, particularly, if you like, with AI, on the horizon and other kinds of modalities in the work. So I think that's an important moment. Yes?
So you mentioned you want to close a distance between structure and the skin, and to reduce the redundance, and you also mentioned performance for some efficiency design, for adding efficiency. And also you mentioned the lack of budgets when doing some...
The lack of what?
Budgets.
Budgets.
When doing some works. So how do you balance, the complexity you add into the projects, and to also fulfill your passionate idea? Because when we, as students doing design, we either going too crazy in one idea, or sometimes we just don't articulate it. So
Look, you have to pick your battles. We are one of those types of architects that spent 10 years on a pattern of elaboration such that every project seemed as if it was the last project we were ever going to do, and so we stuffed it all in there and eventually became the victims of our own project. And now we've spent the next 10 years trying to edit out and erase that which is, let's say, unnecessary. But part of that, I think, is, let's say, to have the confidence that, the conceptual armature of this project is more important than your prowess in being able to do such ingenious work. I mean, so to some degree, critical judgment, decorum, and understanding the occasion for something is sometimes more discerning than the sheer ability of just doing anything. And if you don't do that, well, the budget will do that for you. But I think sometimes budgets and clients act as a positive check and balance for us. And of course, sometimes they ruin it too. But I think it's an important, insofar as practice is not ever scripted, you never know what's actually going to happen. To be able to improvise is probably the most important aspect of learning how to operate critically with your own surpluses.
Thanks for the lecture. I thought what was so fascinating about the way that you described the project was around this issue, which is that one suggestion might be that the speculative practice lies in understanding the means and methods of the architect versus the means and method of the contractor.
Yeah.
And that representation might be the means with which we extend our means and methods towards theirs.
Uh-huh.
That to me, so like the drawing is a reflective ceiling plan, and the plumb line is so great to me because it's a low tech but also deep understanding of like both, right? Both fields. I wonder how that squares with you with the high tech driven fabrication that you were talking about at the end as in this role as a kind of speculative practice.
It's funny, I've never thought of the high tech as high tech because no matter where you are, your interface with local cultures is so dominant that it always becomes something slightly different. So for instance, if you do a project in Boston or in New York, they'll say, oh, no, that's a steel city, that's a concrete city. I mean, what do you mean that's a concrete city, that's a steel city? Well, the way that union labor is cast is such that a market may be completely dominated by residential apartment buildings in concrete in one city and the steel in another. And neither, I mean, it's just a convention. Both of them, I mean, they operate with different kinds of budgetary logics, but labor is a major element that mediates between these things. The other thing, of course, that is interesting is when you're not working in, let's say, advanced countries, because you know what's the problem with working in the United States? You have to specify products. The beauty of working in Chile or in Mexico or in China or in Iran is that while there are products, there's a lot of latitude to develop systems of materials, aggregations, sections that are custom without paying the premium of what we call custom here. And so they're much more allowing of A, the architect's participation in the process, B, the inventive moment, the moment where you can actually advance the state of some form of construction. The other thing I want to say, because I don't want to misrepresent myself here, is that I've actually never been to a shop. That's not what I do. I'm not one of those guys that has gone to the site and hammered studs together. This is not... that is as far away as anything as this my argument is. I mean, obviously I respect and I appreciate what builders and trades bring to the occasion, but that is precisely my point, in that the best thing that I think we can do is embed ourselves in a deep way into understanding the logics of what they do, because once you do that, you may find loopholes in what they do that they never found themselves. And if you do that, that's a moment where you're using generative techniques or representational tools that are transformative but already latent within their current practices. So to some degree, I think there's two things we're talking about here. I think there are, the majority of this work, let's say, resides in the adoption of certain conventions and then transforming them to the state of the unfamiliar or the defamiliar. I think it was said earlier much better. And then there are moments where art and science come into confluence. I'm thinking of the work of Skylar Tibbets, where there's genuinely a more inventive moment where you're doing something unprecedented. And I'm deeply aware and appreciative of that. And it's different than what we're able to do. But it requires the academic insularity to be able to do that.
Maybe one last question. I love the way you have brought tectonics into almost every section heading in your work. And as an amateur lover of geology, I think about plate tectonics and the shifting globe on which we all are floating. Could you talk a little bit about, just give me a sense of your own understanding of plate tectonics, and then we'll have some plates at dinner.
I have no understanding of plate tectonics, and I at that moment when I was trying to write my first essay some years ago, I was saying, well, why is it that everybody in architecture uses tectonics? It's just the kind of the go-to word. And I looked it up and I saw geology and I said, but this has nothing to do with what we're doing. So I went to Stan Anderson, and the way that he describes it, and I'm going to make it my own by the time it's out, is that there's this tension between the technical mandates of a structure and its expression, such that there's a sufficient loose fit that produces this predicament that we call tectonics. This is absolutely my wording. He will never have said it this way, but that's, when you look, what he describes is the antithesis of a column. When we precisely know that the column is bearing weight, but it's not billowing as a result of that weight, the expression nonetheless is to be demonstrative of that weight. So in my discussion about tectonics, I am almost constantly making reference to the slippery terrain between what we may construe to be the truth and what we may construe to be the fiction of the discipline, and establish the space of ethics that binds them together. I haven't answered your question because I can't. Thank you.